Do you want to have total control over your dynamics? Compressors are only half the story. You need to understand expansion. Hey guys, Joey here, and in today's video, I'm going to show you a type of dynamics processor you may not already be using. I'm talking about expanders. Expanders are like compressors, except they actually increase dynamic range rather than reduce it. Before we can get into expansion, you need to understand directional dynamics. There's a lot to unpack here, so let's dive right in. Dynamics processors work in two directions, downward and upward. Downward compression is the easiest to understand since that's what basic compressors do. The input signal hits a threshold and the volume is reduced, creating less dynamic range. Upwards compression works by increasing the volume of anything under a threshold. An easy way to think about the directions is to look at the relationship between the signal and the threshold. If dynamic range is controlled by taking the loudest parts down towards the threshold, it's downward, and if the quietest parts are raised up towards the threshold, it's upward. Here's what they sound like. Upwards and downwards expansion is the same idea, except the signal is moving away from the threshold. So if a signal exceeds the threshold, upwards expansion increases its volume. And if a signal is under the threshold, downwards expansion reduces the volume. Check it out. Okay, cool. Now that we've covered the basics, let's look at some of the examples. If you've already watched this whole series on compression, you'll be familiar with downward compression. Use this to control transients and bring the peak closer to the body of a source. If you haven't seen the other videos in this series, check them out for an in-depth understanding of downwards compression. Upwards compression is used when the loudest part of a signal sounds good and the body just needs to be brought up. A snare drum is a great example of how this works. Check it out. Bringing up the quieter parts of the snare gives it more body. Just be careful not to overdo it, or the transient is going to get lost. This is also really interesting on vocals.
There's one of us here without virtue. Look in the mirror, I don't want to. You're keeping me down for your debut, but your reign is through. There's one of us here without virtue. Look in the mirror, I don't want to. You're keeping me down for your debut, but your reign is through.
By increasing the volume of the quiet parts, the vocal is a little fatter, and by leaving the loudest peaks alone, the performance still has natural movement. Combining upwards and downwards compression is a great way to totally level a vocal and make sure that its volume is basically static.
There's one of us here without virtue. Look in the mirror, I don't want to. You're keeping me down for your debut, but your reign is through. There's one of us here without virtue. Look in the mirror, I don't want to. You're keeping me down for your debut, but your reign is through.
Now let's try it on a full mix. I'm going to keep the reduction subtle because upwards compression can sound really unnatural if it's overdone. Cool. That brought up some of the dynamic floor and makes the whole track a little louder. Running this in parallel can be effective, just dial back the mix knob. Upwards compression is an interesting way to control dynamics. Just make sure to bypass a plugin to make sure that the sound is better, not just different. Upwards expansion is super useful. If something doesn't have enough transient impact, an expander can be used to increase the volume of the peaks. On drums, that's the transient. Check out how much attack I can add to a shell group with some careful expansion. Expansion can be used in parallel to hype a signal without totally destroying the dynamic control. Let's try it on a vocal.
All my life I was saying smoke. All my life I was saying smoke.
Now let's do the same thing on the mix bus. The transients cut a little more with some expansion. Just like the upwards compression, be careful how much the signal is expanded. A song can get really pokey and thin with too much transient information. The easiest way to think about downwards expansion is to look at a gate. Anything under the threshold is reduced. This is cool for getting bleed out of drum tracks or cutting breaths on vocals. I'm going to take this idea even further. A multiband expander can be used to add transients while cutting bleed. By adjusting the attack and release times on the high band, I can get a snappy transient that goes away before the cymbals are audible. The key to this trick is to reduce the volume of the high band when it's not being expanded. That way, all that high frequency noise is out of the way when there's no transient. This is super useful on tom tracks. If you don't have a multiband expander, you can get similar results with JST Tominator. No matter what method is used, the idea is the same. Get a loud transient with a short attack and then release it quickly. Try this one in your own mixes and see if it cleans things up. This gets really cool when the reduction range isn't so drastic. Background elements that need to be ducked quickly, like supporting vocals, strings, and sound effects, can benefit from downwards expansion. The idea is that the impact is preserved and the tail is reduced. Hard gating is a 100% reduction under the threshold, but soft gating can be used to tuck the sustain of an instrument back into the mix. This is effective in dense mixes where everything is fighting to be heard. Check it out. By reducing the volume of the sustain, the transient pops a little more without muddying the track. Each of these processors affect the dynamic range of a sound. Remember that the direction of the processing is what determines the name. Downwards compression brings the signal closer to the threshold from above, and upwards compression brings it closer from below. Upwards expansion boosts the signal above the threshold, and downwards expansion reduces the volume under the threshold. Practice using each of these effects alone and in combination with each other. The differences can be subtle, so make sure you take note of how the sound changes. My advice would be to use thresholds and ratios that are way overdone to get a feel for exactly what each one does. Then you can dial it back. Do you use all 4 of these dynamic processors? What part of the mix are you using them on? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and if you like this video, hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to check the links in the description below and tap that bell to get notified whenever we upload new videos. Until next time, happy mixing.